This week, inside the Oval Office, the most unprecedented diplomatic confrontation in North American history reached its breaking point. For the first time since the War of 1812, an American president sat across from a Canadian leader and openly discussed the annexation of Canada as a serious policy objective. The meeting between Donald Trump and Mark Carney on January 27, 2026 was not a routine diplomatic courtesy call between allied nations, but rather a high-stakes negotiation over the fundamental question of Canadian sovereignty in the face of explicit American imperial ambitions. The words exchanged in that room represented more than political theater or negotiating tactics. They marked the crystallization of a complete transformation in the relationship between two countries that have shared the world as longest undefended border for over a century. What emerged from that meeting was clear evidence that the foundational assumptions governing North American geopolitics have been permanently shattered. The immediate catalyst for this historic confrontation was Trump's weekend escalation regarding Canada's limited trade adjustments with China. Trump's threat to impose 100% tariffs on Canadian goods over what he characterized as a China trade deal represented a fundamental misunderstanding or deliberate misrepresentation of Canadian trade policy. But the tariff threat was merely the latest weapon in a systematic campaign to pressure Canada into submission that had been building for over a year. The pattern had become unmistakable by early 2025. Trump's repeated references to Canada as the first state, his insistence on calling Canadian leaders Governor Trudeau and now Governor Carney, his posting of altered maps showing Canada as American territory, and his explicit statements about using the economic force to achieve annexation all pointed to a coherent strategy designed to normalize the concept of Canadian absorption into the United States. But what makes this diplomatic crisis unprecedented is not Trump's imperial rhetoric, which many observers initially dismissed as psychological warfare or negotiating posturing. What makes it historically significant is the response it provoked from the Canadian political system and the Canadian population. The annexation threats accomplished what no external challenge has achieved since World War II. They unified Canadian public opinion across party lines and rejection of American influence, and created the political conditions for a fundamental realignment of Canada as international relationships. Mark Carney's emergence as Prime Minister was directly connected to Trump's annexation campaign. Carney, a former Bank of England governor with extensive international credibility, had initially been reluctant to enter Canadian politics. But Trump's escalating threats against Canadian sovereignty provided the catalyst that brought Carney into the leadership race and ultimately into the Prime Minister, his office. Carney campaigned explicitly on a platform of resistance to American pressure, adopting the hockey term elbows up to describe his defensive stance against Trump's aggression. The electoral response was decisive. Canadians, traditionally hesitant to directly confront American preferences, rallied behind Carney's message of sovereign independence. Polling data from the spring of 2025 showed that Trump's annexation rhetoric had achieved what decades of Canadian nationalism had failed to accomplish. It created broad public support for policies that would reduce Canadian dependence on American markets and American approval. Carney's victory represented more than a change in party leadership. It represented a generational shift in Canadian strategic thinking. For the first time since Confederation, Canada elected a prime minister whose primary qualification was his ability to stand up to American pressure. This was not about trade disputes or policy disagreements, but about the fundamental question of whether Canada would continue to exist as an independent nation. The January 27th White House meeting crystallized these dynamics in a single conversation that revealed the true scope of the crisis. His statement that Canada was not for sale, won't be for sale, ever, was delivered not as a rhetorical flourish, but as a formal rejection of American imperial ambitions. His comparison of Canada to the White House itself as a property that would never be for sale was a deliberate diplomatic signal that Canadian sovereignty was non-negotiable regardless of American pressure. But the real revelation from that meeting was not what was said publicly, but what the interaction revealed about the fundamental shift in power dynamics between the two countries. For decades, Canadian leaders had traveled to Washington to seek American approval for Canadian policies. They came as supplicants, hoping to secure American market access or American security guarantees. Carney came to Washington as the leader of a sovereign nation prepared to defend its independence against American threats. The difference in approach was immediately apparent to observers familiar with Canada-US diplomatic history. Previous Canadian prime ministers had typically sought to minimize differences with American administrations and to emphasize shared interests and common values. Carney's approach was fundamentally different. He acknowledged that the old relationship, based on steadily increasing integration, was over, and that new arrangements would need to be negotiated between equals rather than between a dominant power and a subordinate ally. This shift in Canadian approach reflected deeper changes in the strategic environment that had made continued subordination to American preferences both politically impossible and strategically counterproductive. Trump's explicit threats against Canadian sovereignty had destroyed the trust that had made the previous relationship workable. Canadians could no longer assume that their security and prosperity were guaranteed by alignment with American interests when American leadership was openly discussing the elimination of Canadian independence. The economic dimensions of the crisis were equally significant. Trump's tariff threats were not simply protectionist measures designed to support American manufacturing. They were instruments of political coercion designed to make Canadian independence economically unsustainable. The 25% tariffs imposed on Canadian goods in March 2025, followed by increases to 35% in August, and now threats of 100% tariffs, were calculated to create economic pressure that would force Canadian capitulation to American political demands. The Canadian response revealed sophisticated understanding of this economic warfare. Rather than simply absorbing American tariffs and hoping for eventual American goodwill, Canada implemented carefully targeted retaliatory measures designed to impose maximum political cost on American decision-makers, while minimizing damage to Canadian interests. Canadian tariffs focused on American agricultural products and manufactured goods from politically sensitive regions, creating pressure on American politicians to reconsider the wisdom of economic confrontation with their largest trading partner. More importantly, Canada began systematic diversification of its economic relationships to reduce dependence on American markets. The trade adjustments with China that provoked Trump's latest threats were part of a broader Canadian strategy to develop alternative markets for Canadian exports and alternative sources for Canadian imports. This was not anti-American policy, but rather pro-Canadian policy designed to ensure that Canadian economic security was not dependent on American political approval. The timing of these developments was particularly significant because they coincided with the mandatory review of the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement scheduled for 2026. What had been expected to be a routine renewal process had instead become a fundamental renegotiation of North American economic relationships in the context of explicit American threats against the sovereignty of both neighboring countries. Canada entered this renegotiation process from a fundamentally different position than it had occupied during previous trade negotiations. Instead of seeking American approval for continued market access, Canada was now negotiating as an independent power with alternative options for its economic relationships. The diversification of Canadian trade relationships had created bargaining power that previous Canadian negotiators had lacked. The psychological impact of this transformation extended far beyond trade policy. For the first time in generations, Canadians were forced to confront the possibility that their independence was not guaranteed by geography, historical precedent, or American goodwill. The annexation threats had made explicit what had previously been implicit, that Canadian sovereignty existed only so long as it served American interests or remained too insignificant to warrant American attention. This realization had profound implications for Canadian strategic planning across all domains. Canadian defense policy, traditionally built around the assumption of permanent American alliance, now had to consider scenarios in which American forces might become threats rather than protectors. Canadian economic policy, historically designed to maximize integration with American markets, now had to prioritize independence and diversification. Canadian foreign policy, typically coordinated with American preferences, now required independent analysis of Canadian interests. The transformation was particularly evident in Canadian public opinion. Polling data from late 2025 and early 2026 showed unprecedented levels of Canadian skepticism toward American leadership and American intentions. The percentage of Canadians who viewed the United States as a reliable ally fell to historic lows, while support for policies that would reduce Canadian dependence on American approval reached historic highs. This shift in public opinion created political space for Canadian policies that would have been considered dangerously anti-American in previous decades. Carney's ability to openly defy American preferences and to threaten economic retaliation against American pressure reflected changes in Canadian political culture that made resistance to American demands not only acceptable but politically essential. The international dimensions of the crisis added additional complexity to the bilateral confrontation. European allies, Asian partners, and other middle powers were closely observing the Canada-US dispute as a test case for American behavior toward allies under Trump's leadership. If the United States could successfully pressure Canada into submission through economic coercion and annexation threats, no middle power could consider itself secure from similar American demands. This broader context provided Canada with potential allies in its resistance to American pressure. European countries facing their own trade disputes with the Trump administration recognized that Canadian success in resisting American economic coercion would strengthen their own negotiating positions. Asian countries, seeking alternatives to both American and Chinese dominance, saw Canadian independence as validation of middle power strategies for maintaining autonomy in a multipolar world. The precedent being established in the Canada-US confrontation extended far beyond North American relationships. If economic coercion and annexation threats proved effective against America's closest ally and most integrated trading partner, they would certainly be employed against other countries that challenged American preferences or pursued independent policies. Carney's resistance to American pressure therefore carried implications that extended well beyond Canadian domestic politics. His willingness to accept economic costs in defense of political independence provided a model for other middle powers facing similar American pressure. His success in maintaining Canadian sovereignty despite unprecedented American threats would demonstrate that resistance to imperial pressure was possible even for countries with extensive economic integration with the dominant power. The outcome of this confrontation would determine not only the future of Canadian independence, but also the broader question of whether middle powers could maintain sovereignty in an international system increasingly dominated by great power competition and economic coercion. The stakes extended far beyond trade disputes or diplomatic protocols to encompass fundamental questions about the nature of sovereignty and independence in the modern international system. As the crisis continued to evolve, both sides were operating with full awareness of these broader implications. Trump's annexation campaign represented more than opportunistic pressure against a vulnerable neighbor. It represented a test of American ability to reshape North American geography through economic pressure and political intimidation. Success would validate similar approaches toward other countries that challenged American preferences or pursued policies inconsistent with American interests. Carney's resistance represented equally significant stakes from the Canadian perspective. Failure to maintain Canadian independence in the face of American pressure would not only end Canadian sovereignty, but would also demonstrate that economic integration inevitably led to political absorption regardless of legal frameworks, historical precedents, or cultural differences. The January 27th meeting in the Oval Office was therefore much more than a diplomatic encounter between neighboring countries. It was a defining moment in the evolution of international relationships between dominant powers and their smaller neighbors. The conversation between Trump and Carney crystallized fundamental questions about sovereignty, independence, and the limits of economic coercion in modern international relations. The words exchanged in that room will be studied by historians and political scientists for decades as documentation of how imperial powers test the resolve of smaller nations and how those nations respond when their fundamental independence is challenged. The outcome of this confrontation will shape not only the future of North America, but also the broader patterns of international relations in an era of renewed great power competition. What makes this crisis unprecedented in North American history is not simply the explicit nature of American annexation threats, but the sophisticated and determined nature of Canadian resistance. For the first time since the War of 1812, Canada and the United States are engaged in a fundamental contest over the basic question of Canadian independence, and the outcome remains uncertain. The broader implications of this confrontation extend to questions of alliance structure and international law that have governed Western relationships since World War II. If economic integration does not provide protection against imperial absorption, then the entire framework of international cooperation based on mutual benefit rather than imperial domination comes into question. The Canada-US crisis has therefore become a test case for whether smaller powers can maintain independence in an integrated global economy or whether economic interdependence inevitably leads to political subordination. The resolution of this crisis will establish precedents that influence international relationships for generations. Success in Canadian resistance to American annexation pressure will provide a model for other middle powers seeking to maintain independence despite economic integration with dominant neighbors. Failure will validate imperial strategies of economic coercion and political pressure as effective tools for territorial expansion. The stakes could not be higher for both countries and for the international system. What began as trade disputes and diplomatic rhetoric has evolved into a fundamental challenge to the principles of sovereignty and independence that have governed international relations since the end of the colonial era. The annexation ultimatum represents a test of whether nations can remain free in an age of economic empire and imperial ambition.